Hi, I'm Chang of Flower Bakery. I'm going to be showing you today how to make yellow birthday cake and talking to you about all of the science behind making birthday cake. So first, let me show you all the ingredients we have for a yellow birthday cake. We have unsalted butter, granulated sugar, we have eggs and egg yolks, and there's a little bit of vanilla in here as well. We also have some buttermilk, and then our dry ingredients, which are flour, and then in this container are combined baking soda, baking powder, and kosher salt. Okay, the first thing I do is I'm going to put the butter into a mixer. You could do this by hand, but I promise you after about 10 minutes your arms will be really tired. So if you can, do it in a mixer. Now, one of the things that's important about the butter is that we want it to be at room temperature. Now, why is it important that the butter is at room temperature? Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding millions and millions of minuscule microscopic air pockets into the butter. And we're going to do that with our sugar. If you imagine sugar, it's an actual crystal, right? Sugar is a crystal. And the crystalline structure of the sugar, what it does is it acts as tiny little shovels into the butter, and it digs all of these little holes and makes little minuscule pockets of air. If the butter's too cold, then the sugar can't do its work. The shovels just aren't strong enough. So you want to make sure you start off with room temperature butter. I'm going to slowly start adding the sugar, and as I'm doing this, the butter is slowly starting to get more and more worked up. And I'm going to show this to you once all of the butter gets put in. Now, why is it so important that I have all of these air pockets? So if you imagine what you want for the ideal birthday cake, you want something that's nice and light and fluffy and tender and velvety. And the last thing in the world you want is a really tough, hard to eat, chewy cake. So what we try to do in the making of the cake is create as many opportunities as possible for science to do its magic and take all of these ingredients and turn them into something light and fluffy and delicious. So when I talk about the sugar creating air pockets into the butter, later on when I actually added all of these ingredients to the cake batter and I put that batter into the oven, all of those pockets of air will expand in the oven once they get into the heat of the oven. And that is what is going to help cause some of the rise of the cake. And the rise of the cake is what's going to make the cake really light and fluffy instead of heavy and dense. So you can see why it's really important that we add all of these air pockets like we're doing right now. So from a baking perspective, what I'm doing right now is called creaming the butter and sugar together. And the reason it's called that is that in the very beginning, as you saw, the butter's kind of a yellow color. It's not really light or pale looking. It's definitely very, very yellow. Once you add the sugar and you cream it for about 4 to 5 minutes, you see that because all of the air has been added to the butter, the mixture turns really pale and almost cream colored. So because of that, in baking, we call this step creaming of butter and sugar. So I'm going to turn up the mixer just a little bit now that the sugar is totally mixed in, and I'm going to let the mixer do its work. And I'm going to show you the inside so you can see how different the color is once the sugar has acted on the butter. What started out as a really kind of a very yellowish, buttery color is now a little bit lighter and a little bit paler, and that's because of all the air that's been beaten into the butter. So I'm going to put this back. So the next ingredient I'm going to add, once this is turned a little bit lighter and a little bit fluffier, is the eggs. Now the eggs are really important in this cake because eggs act as an emulsifier. And what I mean by that is we have butter and sugar, we have liquid ingredients, and we have dry ingredients. And in order for them to all combine really smoothly together, you need an emulsifier. And that's what eggs do. I'm just going to scrape down the side of the bowl a little bit. A lot of times the butter and the sugar likes to collect on the bottom and on the paddle. And what ends up happening is if you have a little pocket of butter and sugar that doesn't get mixed into the batter, then that leads to a big tunnel in your cake. So when you're eating your cake, you might take a bite and it's really beautiful and the grain is perfect and it just looks amazing. And then you get kind of this big hole and it's a little bit chewy. That's when the butter and sugar isn't thoroughly mixed into the batter. And so what I do is I scrape the bowl to make sure that it all gets combined thoroughly. So what I'm going to do is on very low speed, I'm just going to add the eggs and the yolks little by little. So as I said, the eggs act as an emulsifier, but they also act as a flavoring because there's a lot of fat in egg yolks. And from a baking perspective, one of the things we always say is fat carries flavor. So whenever you have a lot of fat in a dish or a pastry, you know that it's going to be really flavorful because the fat actually carries all of the flavor to your palate. So you want to make sure not to rush this step. If you add all the eggs all at once, then what happens is they don't blend into the butter and sugar and they just kind of swim. The butter and sugar kind of swims in with the eggs and then you get a really lumpy cake. So slowly, slowly, I'm going to take a pause and scrape, because again, that's important to make sure everything gets mixed in thoroughly. Okay, so I just scraped it down. Get that going again. We're going to add a couple more, not too fast. Emulsifications are really big in baking and in cooking. I'm going to let that go just for a couple seconds. And now let me show you. So you can see that it's still really smooth and the butter and the sugar were creamed together and now the eggs have been mixed in. While I have it off, I'm just going to give it one more scrape. And I should have mentioned this earlier if I didn't, but the eggs also need to be at room temperature. If you put in cold eggs, and all of a sudden what you're doing is you're introducing the element of temperature into the batter, and you end up having little cold pieces of butter that solidify upon contact with the eggs. So make sure that your eggs are the same temperature as your butter and your sugar. Okay, so now I have my dry ingredients. This is where a lot of the magic happens. So I'm just going to give this a stir. This again is flour, baking soda, baking powder, and buttermilk. Now when I'm making a cake, my goal is to make a really tender velvety product. And so I'm trying to counter what happens a lot of times when you work with flour. Flour contains a lot of gluten. And what is gluten? Gluten is actually the thing that makes bread really chewy. And so if you take a really great artisan loaf of bread and you tear it open, you see all those chewy strands, it's like really beautiful, and you eat it and it's so great. That's really great for bread, but it's really bad for cake. So what we try to do is make sure to minimize the gluten development. Now, how does gluten get activated in flour? Because the gluten is in the flour, it's part of the flour. It's only activated when it comes in contact with liquid. So that's my challenge. I have a dry ingredient, flour, that has a lot of gluten in it, and then I have a wet ingredient. If I put them together, I'm going to end up getting long, chewy strands, which would be great if I was making bread, but I'm making a cake. So what to do? What I'm going to try to do then is I'm going to put some of the flour in with the butter. Now the butter, the fat, does this remarkable thing where it coats all of the flour particles. So as it's coating the flour particles, it's acting as a barrier so that when I add the liquid, then the liquid can't get into the flour particles and then the gluten can't be activated. Now so I'm going to do this in stages. I'm going to put about a third of the dry, and then half of the liquid, another third of the dry, the rest of the liquid, and the rest of the dry. And you might say, well, why don't I just dump all of the dry in here and then add all of the liquid? What ends up happening if I put in all of the dry is that the batter gets so stiff that as I start adding the liquid, it takes way too long to add all the liquid and to have it all combine into a batter. And you end up beating the batter too long and you end up with a tough cake. So what we have is this alternative method. It's called the 3-2 method, where I put in about a third of the dry. And then as soon as most of the dry is mixed, I put about half of the buttermilk. So this is like gradually combining these ingredients while trying to minimize the gluten development. Then I put in the second third of the dry. The rest of the buttermilk. And then finally, the last of the dry. Now we've kind of skipped over one of the most important parts of making this cake, which is the leavening. So let me talk to you a little bit about the leaveners that are in this cake. And when I say leaveners, what I mean is the things that are going to make this cake actually rise. We talked a little bit ago about all of the air pockets. Once those air pockets that are in this batter go into the oven, the steam that's within the batter will start to cause all of the air pockets to get larger, and that in turn will help make the batter rise. But that alone isn't enough to make a nice fluffy cake. What also will make a nice fluffy cake are two ingredients that I mentioned earlier, and those are the baking soda and the baking powder. These are chemical leaveners. Baking soda is a leavener that reacts with acids. And what I mean by that is if you take baking soda and you actually mix it with something acidic, I mean, if you wanted to do an experiment with something like vinegar, you can actually see immediately that the baking soda starts to bubble up and foam up, and you're creating all of those bubbles. And if you imagine that action within a cake, then your cake batter goes from being dense to light and fluffy. So in this cake, we didn't put vinegar, but what we did put was buttermilk. Buttermilk is very acidic, and the buttermilk will react with the baking soda, and that will cause the batter to basically rise. We can't see it right now, but inside the chemical reactions in the batter, there's a lot of reactions going on where the batter is starting to rise. The heat makes that happen a lot faster, which is why we put this batter into the oven, because then that creates even more rapid action. The second leavener is baking powder. So baking powder is actually baking soda plus an acid. And you often use baking powder, for example, in a recipe like this, where you have a limited amount of acid. We only had that little bit of buttermilk. It wasn't that much. And I knew that I wanted the cake to be lighter, fluffier, even more velvety and tender. So what do? If I added more baking soda, that wouldn't help because there's no acid to work with the baking soda to create the leavening. So what I do is I add baking powder, which is baking soda and an acid. The acid is called cream of tartar, and that is what makes up baking powder. It's baking soda plus cream of tartar. And that's also going to work to leaven the cake. So I have my cake pan. I'm going to go ahead and put the batter in the cake pan. And then this cake is going to go into the oven, and immediately once it goes into the oven, the heat is going to activate the baking powder. It's going to activate all of the air pockets that are in the batter. All of the steam is going to start happening, and you're going to see that it's going to get nice and light and fluffy. Okay, so we're going to put this in the oven. Okay, so here's my finished cake. Now, you might ask, hey, wait, you told me that the cake was going to get lighter and fluffier, and it doesn't look like it is. Well, what actually happened was I put all of the batter into one pan, And then earlier on, we did this recipe. This is half of the batter. So you can see that half of the batter bakes up into almost the same amount as all of the batter. And just to prove it to you, here's the other half of the cake. I just didn't have 2 cake pans to show you with this original one. Okay, I'm gonna cut into this cake, and that way you can see the structure of the cake. So you can see all of those bubbles have made this cake really light and fluffy and tender. And if we didn't have all the bubbles, then we would end up something dense and hard as a brick, which is not what we would want for a birthday cake. So that's the science behind yellow birthday cake.